It appeared in newspapers across the country, including the LA Times, the Charlotte Observer, the New Orleans Tribune, Detroit Free Press, and the San Francisco Examiner. Hosted television and radio programs and appeared widely as a commentator on networks including CNN, BET, PBS, NBC, ABC, Fox News, MSNBC, CNBC, C-SPAN, our favorite station, and others. She also served as the 15th president of Bennett College for Women, America's oldest historically black women's college, received her PhD in economics from MIT and her bachelor's and master's degrees from Boston College. Thank you for your coming, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chair Cohen, thank you so very much for this opportunity. I also want to thank my sister friend, Congresswoman.
The mic may not be on.
Okay, sorry about that.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to thank my sister friend, Dr. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, and my twin sister over there, Congresswoman Karen Bass. People frequently comment on our resemblance. And of course, Congressman Nadler, for your work and your leadership, Keenan, and Dr. Ron Daniels, who was here and has been mentioned for his leadership of NARC, the National African American Reparations Commission, on which I serve. I am delighted to be here because this hearing is not on time, it's like overtime. It's more than time for us to deal with the injustices that African American people not only have experienced in history, but continue to experience. I'm an economist, so economics is a study of who gets what, when, where, and why. It's a study of the way the factors of production are paid. The elements are land, labor, capital, and the secret sauce. Some people call it entrepreneurial ability, some call it creativity. Land gets rent, labor gets wages, capital gets interest, and the secret sauce gets profits. But the work of predatory capitalists is to figure out how to extract more from the factors of production toward capital and away from people. And we've seen that in the past 3 decades with our own economy, but more importantly, enslavement was about the devil's work of predatory capitalism. Indeed, enslaved people got no wages, and we represented capital for other people. And so after enslavement, first of all, enslavement was the foundation on which our country was built. So anybody who says, well, I didn't have any slaves, no, you didn't have to have any. What you had to do was experience them, enjoy the fact that they were here, enjoy the fact that their labor made it possible for there to be a Wall Street, a bond market, and all of that. But beyond that, I want to speak specifically to Section 3B3 of the legislation. That's a part that talks about the federal and state laws that discriminate against formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants who are deemed United States citizens. From Robert Higgs in a book called Competition and Coercion, Blacks in the American Economy, 1865 to 1914, he shows that in 1880, the ratio of black to white wealth was $1 black dollar for 36 white dollars. 1890, 1 to 26. 1900, 1 to 23. 1910, 1 to 16. Today, 1 to 20. In other words, we're almost worse off in 2019 than we were in 1910 because of evil. Because basically there have been deliberate attempts to marginalize African American people, especially those who are formerly enslaved, because of the interests of predatory capitalism, and because it was expedient to maintain the status quo of having free black labor and to prevent wealth accumulation. Despite the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, black people were treated as other and perniciously and viciously excluded from the possibilities of economic advancement. The Emergency Land Fund documented the reduction of black land ownership between 1910 and 1969 from 16 million acres to 6 million acres. How and why? Land grabs, tax schemes, faulty deeds, and downright force. My own family in Moss Point, Mississippi, experienced the expropriation of land through a moving fence, like the fence moved one night. We used to have the land, and we didn't have the land. Years later, after a couple of cousins were lynched, they changed the name of the land to Hawkins Lane, so they named it after us, but we didn't get it back. Joseph Brooks in 1978 estimated that black folks were losing 6,000 acres of land per week. And we saw what happened with the Agriculture Department. The post-enslavement case for reparations can be made by examining racially hostile public policy and government complicity to white supremacy. You all have an article that I wrote for the ACLU that talks about several cases: Memphis, Wilmington, North Carolina, Tulsa, Oklahoma. But these were the tip of the iceberg. This happened everywhere. The journalist Ida B. Wells said that lynching was the first example of white supremacy because it was a tool of terrorism. It dampened the ability of African-American people to participate in the vibrant entrepreneurship of the late 19th and early 20th century with a chilling message that our economic success could be punished by the rope. The economic damage to Black people post-Reconstruction can be summarized in 3 ways. Number 1, we were denied the ability to participate in our nation's economic growth. The Homestead Act of 1862 did not include formerly enslaved people. More than 10% of the continental U.S. land was distributed to recent immigrants from Europe, but not Black folks. So the 40 acres and a mule was given to somebody else, not us. These folks were able not only to get land, but then to get grants from the federal government to develop their land. Meanwhile, African-American people were denied the right to these wealth transfers. Secondly, we were denied the right to accumulate. The paper that I mentioned talks about how our accumulation was essentially stymied by lynching. The first lynching that Ida B. Wells examined was one when a Black man had the utter nerve to open up a grocery store near a white man's store. So the white man had a brother lynched, had 3 people lynched because of economic envy. Listen to those words, economic envy. This is how Black people have been suppressed in their ability to accumulate. Tulsa, Oklahoma, Wilmington, North Carolina, long stories, and I don't have any time to talk about them. But I want y'all to look at the paper that I submitted and to think about the many ways that Black people who tried to participate, tried to encourage, tried to be American, simply tried to be economic actors, were suppressed because they had the nerve to think it worked. So my brothers over here who say their American dream is some people's American nightmare. Let's just be clear. Now, number 3 is public policy hostility. There's public policy hostility to Black people. GI Bill legislation truncated opportunities for African-American veterans. Federal Housing Administration reinforced redlining and segregation as an official policy of the federal government. People talk about racists as if they're individuals. Yes, sir. But the fact is they're not individuals. They're individuals who are buttressed by the federal government and legislation. So let me simply say HR 40 is important. NARC has developed a 10-point plan, but more importantly, as you, my brothers and sisters on this Congress, go forward, may there be a racial justice audit of any new legislation that has economic implications. Thank you.
Woo, woo. Doc. So we have with us the great Dr. Julianne. Thank you so much, Doctor, for joining me today. I know you are a busy person, Doc. I'm telling you, when I first saw you on during the HR 40 hearing, Doc, I was blown away. I mean, I was taken back by the amount of information that you brought in 5 minutes. I mean, you literally, laid out the case for reparation in 5 minutes. You talked about economic envy. You brought up Ida B. Wells, and I have her book. I believe it's called Southern Horrors. It's like a small pamphlet. Yeah. Awesome. I have that. Yes, I have that downstairs on my other bookshelf. But you talked about Ida B. Wells and how lynching was a tool, and it was actually more Black owners who got lynched. Remember, they used to accuse Black men of being sexual predators, but then Ida B. Wells changed the myth. She said, wait a minute, they didn't get lynched because of being sexual predators. These were business people who were being lynched. So they used lynching as a tool to keep us economically oppressed. You talked about her. You talked about Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I know in your paperwork, in the article that you mentioned, you talk about other neighborhoods or communities that were thriving economically that was destroyed. So you talked about that. And so, Doc, I just want to say that you did a phenomenal job. Thank you so much for coming on the panel and enlightening my viewers. Family, let's share this video. Let's get more people in the chat room. We have a heavyweight on the platform tonight. Let's get this chat room filled up. Subscribe to the channel, like the video. Thank you so much, Doc, for coming on. How you feeling, Doc?
I'm good. It's been a good day.
It's been a good day, Doc?
Well, I wrote a column that I was pleased with. I'm a perfectionist, and usually I give myself a B+. But today I gave myself an A.
A plus. Beautiful, Doc.
You know, just looking at this idiot that we have in the White House.
Mm-hmm.
And then really, we shouldn't ever call it the White House anymore. We should call it the house that enslaved people built.
Come on, Doc.
Because we built it. But, you know, this man wants to go to Tulsa on Juneteenth to have a rally. This is like a slap in black people's face. But what I said in the column was the only good part about this is that he might become a poster child for Black history. Because I know a lot of white folks who didn't know very much about Tulsa, the Tulsa massacre, or Juneteenth until this fool picked that day to visit Oklahoma. Now, you know, he could have picked the 20th. He could have gone to Norman, Oklahoma. He'd have to go to Tulsa. But this is like in your face, black people move. Just like when he gives his closing speech at the Republican convention, which now is going to be held in Jacksonville, Florida. He's having it on the same day that in history was called Axe Handle Saturday. And Axe Handle Saturday was a day when white people with axes and baseball bats went and attacked a group of black people. So does he have someone on his staff who finds these dates that resonate with violence against black people and use them? Or is he just stupid? I don't know.
You say you don't know. So, Doc, can you explain that? I mean, because some people, you have people who've never heard of Tulsa, Oklahoma. You have people who have never heard of June 19th. And so, Doc, can you educate them on June 19th and in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and why black people should be, in an uproar about the president's decision to go there to have his first rally on the 19th in Tulsa, Oklahoma?
Okay, Juneteenth is a shorthand for June 19th. On June 19th, 1865, the black people of Texas learned that they were free. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed on January 1st, 1863, but the word didn't get to Texas until two years later. And those plantation owners, et cetera, kept folks there and extracted their labor, even though they were technically free. The Civil War was over. But in any case, when someone came, Union soldiers came and said, y'all free, that was June 19th, and the formerly enslaved people hooped and hollered and partied and celebrated and tried to figure out their futures. And June 19th is the anniversary of that, of the day that we knew for sure that we were free. So people, it's a big thing, more so in Texas, Oklahoma, a huge thing in Texas than it is in, let's say, the West Coast. But as black folks, as we communicate with each other, you find people celebrating Juneteenth all over the place. As we deliberately ask for our hearings to be held on Juneteenth, again, to represent this energy.
Absolutely.
Now Tulsa. And as you said, Tulsa was not the first one of these, but the term economic envy speaks to the fact that at the end of enslavement, white people still want to have the status quo. They still want to believe that they were better than black people. They still want to enslave black people or to extort our labor in any number of ways. So the first, as I mentioned, the first lynching that Ida B. Wells documented was over a black man who had the nerve to compete with a white man by putting a store next to his. For that, the brother was lynched. We have records of black people being lynched because they had too much land. One brother because he owned a car, and no white people in the area owned a car, so they just lynched him. This was a way of sort of keeping us in line. Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898. What happened there was an election. Black people and sort of radical Republicans had put together a coalition, and they were ready to elect, or they did elect, basically a majority non-racist city council. But the other white people weren't having it. So one night they took all the prominent black men in the town, put them on a train, and kicked them out. I don't care what you had. If you had property, put you on a train and kicked you out. And there, I would recommend to your viewers a film that you can find on Vimeo called Wilmington on Fire. It's an amazing film that really tells this whole story. So they kicked the folks out. There was a brother in Wilmington who owned a press, and he was always challenging racism. One of the things he especially challenged was the myth that black men were lynched because they were messing with white women. Ida B. Wells showed that only a third of the lynchings had to do with sex. That the others, and some of that sex was consensual sex. Some of the others had to do with economic envy. So in any case, they threw all the prominent Black men out. They put the brothers' printing press on fire. They lit it on fire. They were looking for him to kill, but somebody gave him a heads up. He jumped on a train and got out of town, leaving all his belongings. He had his grandson is on this film. He talked about how they were wealthy Black people. They were well off, but they left with, his grandfather left with nothing. But he left with his life. That's all he had. And but they never counted the number of Black people who were killed in Wilmington. They just went through the neighborhood killing. But there was an author who said the river ran red. There was so much blood in the river ran red. What happened at the end of that? The number of Black-owned businesses in Wilmington went down by a third. Black income and wealth went down. Wilmington was a place that had a dock, had a shipyard, where white men and Black men worked side by side for the same amount of money. But white men weren't having that. So when they reorganized, Black people were earning less. So Wilmington was a horrible situation, not as well known as Tulsa, which I'll talk about in a minute, not as well known as Tulsa, but equally devastating. And of course, Rosewood is another one. We all saw the movie, but that's another one that we really don't talk a lot about. Tulsa has gained in people's knowledge because it really was quite outrageous, because the words like looting and rioting were, those are words that people like to use against Black people. But here you have white looters, white rioters. They like to call the Tulsa riot. It was a Tulsa massacre. Almost, we don't know, 300 plus Black people were killed. Thousands were homeless as a result. And thousands were forced to live in concentration camps because they had nowhere else to live. People couldn't leave the concentration camp unless a good white person vouched for them. Here's what happened. And now, okay, I will reference a lady that was very close to my heart. She died in 2018. Her name was Dr. Olivia Hooker. She was one of the last survivors of Tulsa. She died in 2018, but she was 103 when she died. So she was 6 years old when Tulsa came. Her father owned a department store downtown. And to let her tell it, Black people had everything they needed in their little area of Greenwood. Anything they needed. They couldn't go to the library because the white people had a segregated library. They built their own. You had doctors, you had dentists, you had pharmacies, you had anything you needed. They built a hospital because they got poor treatment at the other hospitals. They were thriving. That's why they called it Black Wall Street. That's why I call it Black Wall Street. At the same time, what Dr. Hooker said is that the white folks were arming themselves. Nothing had happened, but they were preparing for something, not knowing what. Now, a young Black man, 17, Dick Rowland, got into an elevator to go to the top of a building. He was a shoe-shine person, but the only place he could use the restroom was in this building. The elevator operator was a white woman named Sarah Page. She was 17, so they were both teenagers. There's some evidence that they may have known each other. Whatever happened, he touched her. He may have jostled her. The elevator may have been uneven. He didn't rape her. But a white man saw the two of them, saw him touching, and it was like you know how you brush into somebody. And he ran and said, rape, 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 rape. That's what they do. And the newspaper editor actually ran an article called To Lynch a Negro Tonight. So white folks got found a Black man, but found a Black man who raped a white woman. That's what they were waiting for. They arrested Dick Rowland, took him downtown, where the brothers, who were World War I vets, said, oh, no, not this week. You're not going to basically lynch this brother. So Black men were like, it's not going to happen. White men, angered that Black men had guns, went to attack one of the brothers, and the gun went off. Nobody was shot, but the gun went off. White man was like, what the heck is this Black man doing with a gun in my face? we got to go take care of this. So they went to Greenwood, which is a black area of Tulsa, and they just started shooting, burning. An old black doctor, he was old elderly man, came out of his house with his hands up, don't shoot, with his hands up, and they killed him anyway. I mean, they just killed so many black people. And it was also driven by economic envy. Dr. Hooker remembers as a little girl hiding under the table, the dining room table had a long dining room table cover. And she was under, she said she remembered them breaking one of her dolls, breaking her mother's Caruso records. So and ruining their piano. So they're thinking, who are these black people who have pianos and Caruso records? We don't have it. In fact, the governor appointed a commission not many years later, a few months later, to find out what the cause of the uprising was, or the massacre was. And the commission concluded too many N-words have too much money. Now and they wrote it down. Too many N-words have too much money. So basically, this was May 31st to June 1st. By the next day, Tulsa was gone. They had just built a new church. The church was gone. I mean, everything was gone. It was just smolder. And they then opposed martial law on the black people to say, if you can't leave this concentration camp unless you have a pass, or if you're a good Negro, you need a white person to vouch for you. So some of these black middle-class women whose husbands were doctors or lawyers, they were requisitioned to go work at white women's houses. It was just a total outrage. And basically, Tulsa eventually rebuilt, but very shakily. The wounds are still there. But it was a horrible case, and millions of dollars were lost. You wouldn't think the way they talk about us, you wouldn't think we had millions of dollars. But probably $35 million, I've got my numbers right, it's 35 square blocks, and dollars that go with that were lost. That's what happened in Tulsa. And we could go down I've been in the Library of Congress. I haven't been able to go since the corona, but I have a notebook that lists all kinds of crazy lynchings that just had to do with lynchings and this kind of violence. The Red Summer of 1919, when black men came back from World War I, we had a series of white folks turning on black people, burning their neighborhoods, burning their communities, lynching them, killing them. In Washington, D.C., pulling a brother who was a soldier off the streetcar. Why? Because he was black. So we have this history. And for me, the issue, is people should know about this, but they should also know about the economic connections. Because the economic connections are what I think are the most important things here.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Doc. And I think that it was important for Ida B. Wells to dismantle the myth that black men were being lynched because they were sexual predators. You know what I mean, Doc? Like, it was important for her to do that. And so I agree with you. We have to talk about that economic connection. And so Doc, do you think it definitely, in my opinion, I think it was intentional for Trump for him to pick that date. With all of the people around him, even as ignorant as he is, with all of the people around him, I can't believe that he just picked that date and that place arbitrarily,
Well, I was told by an insider that they picked the date. He wanted to go in, this month. And when they came up with the date, he wanted to go to a state where he had a lot of support. So that would be, of course, Oklahoma could be. He didn't want to go to like Michigan where it's a mixed bag. He wanted to go to a solidly red state. Some of his advisors told him, well, you could go to Oklahoma, but you don't have to go on that day. But once he observe his behavior, he doesn't change his mind. Once he digs his heels in, he never apologizes. He never changes his mind. And that's just how it is.
All right, Doc. And so, all right, Doc. So look, I want you to speak on the racial wealth gap. I know you actually kind of answered this question in talking about economic envy, but my question to you was to talk about the racial wealth gap, name and describe the systems and practices that contributed to the wealth gap. So one is slavery, because for 200 plus years, we were enslaved. And so we couldn't we couldn't amass wealth. And then after Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1865, we were free. And then we went into the period of Reconstruction and trying to rebuild. But there were also systems in place like the sharecropping system and convict leasing and all of that that stopped us from or prevented us from acquiring wealth. So, Doc, can you speak on that? Can you give us that history also, Doc?
Sure. I mean, there are three periods. Of course, enslavement is the period where we weren't paid. The period from 1865 to 1876 was the period when Black people accumulated. Those of us, many of us, not many, but those of us who were educated, we were teachers, we helped build our communities. Some of us were entrepreneurs, and we invested in our communities. There is a wonderful, and I don't have the quote in front of me right now, but a wonderful quote from the last Black congressman, and he lists all the things Black people had accomplished. We talk about the number of teachers, the number of amount of land we own, all of that. But in any case, starting 1876, when there was no federal supervision, white folks went butt wild. White folks started passing laws, the Jim Crow laws, laws that basically you couldn't work here, you couldn't own this tool. You know, in some states, you couldn't congregate except for in church, which is why the Black church became at some level, you know, the foundation of our organizing. But if you want to get, in fact, there were 200 plus Black male farmers who were lynched in Arkansas because they tried to organize to raise the price of their crops. Just lynch all of them. Anytime we tried to step up and say, we're going to be economically free, they were like, no, you're not. There's one horrible case with the lynching of a Black woman. And the reason I mention it is because most of the people lynched were Black men. But if you go back in history, there were occasionally Jewish people, not very many, but some. And there were about, I want to say between 60 and 70 Black women who were lynched. But in Valdosta, Georgia, there's an evil white man who didn't want to pay his workers. So the way he got workers is he would go to the jail and bail people out. He would bail them out. And here's the deal. I'll bail you out and you have to work for me so many days, weeks, months, years. He bailed out a man and they had some dispute. And in the dispute, the man killed him and shot his wife. But this was after like months of abuse. The man was forced to go to work. When he was sick, he was whipped, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the brother shot him. So the white man in retaliation, or the white community in Valdosta in retaliation lynched a Black person a day for a week, for almost 14 days, a Black person a day. Anybody who had some relationship with this guy. Now, many of them just knew him. Some of them didn't even know him. They were seen in the same place at the same time. Mary Turner was 18 or 19 years old, 8 months pregnant, and her husband was lynched. He went down to the courthouse and made a stink, said that she was going to find out who lynched her husband, and she was going to go, to the law, and they couldn't get away with that. And they lynched her. They said they did not like her attitude or her tone of voice, so they lynched her. After they lynched her, they tied her up by her ankles from a tree upside down and lit her on fire. One of the things many lynchings are accompanied with fire, although people don't really talk about that. It's just like you put somebody on a tree. Many people were lit on fire, some alive. Mary Turner was alive. After she died, they slit her belly open. Fetus came out because she was almost 9 months pregnant, and they stomped the fetus. Now, all of this was a result of Black men saying, I don't want to work for this crazy man. So the whole issue of work and agency with work becomes another issue. The Chambliss family in Georgia, 15 or 16-year-old boy, they said he should go to Army. He wasn't old enough. He mouthed off at the guy, whatever. They ended up lynching the whole family except for one person, like 7 people, because he mouthed off. So I don't know if I really answered your question because I get on a roll with this stuff.
Doc, please do. I mean, no, the question was, I wanted you to talk about the name and describe the systems and practices that contributed to the wealth gap, and you're doing just that. So please continue. You're talking about different incidents where, you know, Black people were lynched, you know, for economic envy. Keep going, Doc. So,
but so basically, you look at the enslavement period. You look at the Reconstruction period, 1865 to 1876, where that's just 12 years, where we're able to get some things together. You know, 76 on, you look at, we were still doing okay. The white people by 1898 were passing laws that, Plessy versus Ferguson, legal segregation, passing laws about education, passing laws about voting. So you couldn't vote unless various things. My folks are from Mississippi, from a town called Moss Point, Mississippi. And I remember my aunt, who had 2 master's degrees, was studying some tests in like Latin or something. I said, well, Auntie, why do you have to do that? She says, that's what we have to do to vote. They would always switch it up. One time she said they had a jar of jelly beans and you had to guess how many there were. You know, retrospectively, I'm thinking this is more like The Price is Right than voting. But in any case, they prevented us from voting because they had grandfather clauses. You could only vote if your grandfather could vote. Now, if your grandfather was enslaved, then you couldn't vote unless you passed some great crazy test. So I remember that aunt died when she was 101, and she died, I think, in 2000. So she remembered a lot of stuff, and she used to talk about it. But she was very interesting also because, you know, I loved her dearly, but she truly, how can I put it nicely? No, I won't put it nicely.
Don't put it nicely, Doc. Go ahead and speak your mind, Doc.
Just a time. At the end of the day, she was a freedom fighter, but she realized she had to get along with white people. So she tried her hardest to get along with white people while making change. I was sent down there as a 15-year-old child because I was a horrible child. I mean, a horrible child. I admit it. It wasn't my fault, but this particular aunt lived in Moss Point, Mississippi, and if you didn't know how to act, they would send you down there for a few months, and she basically whipped your butt every other day until she thought you got you in shape. Well, she never could whip any good sense into me. But we went to the bank one day, and there was a gentleman named Mr. Dancer, and she said, look at Mr. Dancer. His people used to own us. And she said it with some sense of pride. And so I turned back to her and I said, well, where are my MF reparations then?
Come on.
Next thing you know, I was picking myself up off the floor. But she was an elder. I didn't have any business going there, especially with the MF. But, she would tell these stories, the horrible stories about the segregation, what they basically, were not allowed to do, even, into the 50s and early 60s. Black teachers were paid almost half of what white teachers were paid. Even though Black teachers got paid more if they had master's degrees. White teachers didn't have to have a master's degree. So the laws, you start with Reconstruction and appropriation. You look at the Jim Crow laws. Then you look at the laws I mentioned in the reparations hearing, the ways that federal law prevented us from having some things. Federal law basically sidelined us. So we have to look at that too. Federal Housing Act. So even today, when you look at redlining, the reason why you have a big gap, almost a 20% gap, no, it's about 25% gap between Black home ownership and white home ownership is a function of partially of redlining. We lost about a third of our wealth after the Great Recession of 2008. And I shudder to think of what we've lost in this Corona recession, because we know that approximately 40% of Black people have lost their jobs. So hopefully banks are being kind. They've been directed by the Congress to be kind, but there are differentials. And so in the present day, you have wage gaps, you have unemployment rate gaps, And if so, wages, unemployment rates, your savings are, it's not what you cop, it's what you keep. But if you don't have much to keep, you're not accumulating. And so when you look at some of that, what you see is the contemporary wage gap and unemployment rate gap lead to the wealth gap. The wealth is accumulation. So somebody has been accumulating forever, and many of us have just been accumulating for 1 or 2 generations. One of the other sources of the wealth gap is the student loan gap. Black folks graduate with almost twice as much student loan debt, as white students do. So that makes a difference. So when do you actually begin to start accumulating? When you begin to start buying your house, because you have that delay. So it's almost like every system in place is designed to essentially keep Black people down. And then you have basically what I call it, white ignorance. And one just needs to look no further than 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue to see that. You have folks who are saying things like, well, I don't believe there's anything as systemic racism. Well, how is it then that we end up with twice, as Dr. King said in 1968 in his speech, where do we go from here? He says, Black people had twice of the bad things and half of the good things in life. Twice the unemployment rate, half the wealth. And we don't even have half the wealth, or half of the income. Now our income rate is more like 62%. But Dr. King's statement is a powerful statement about how the pie is divided. And that's really what the wealth is. How do we divide the pie, and who gets to keep what part of it? And so when you give money, to wealthy people through tax breaks, but don't do the same to struggling people or even middle class people through similar tax breaks, you basically widen the wealth gap. And we saw that in the Great Recession. We widened the wealth gap. And so the system is set up to basically keep Black people, and not all Black people. That's the counter argument from maybe a 45 or so. Well, they're rich Black people. Yes, there are rich Black people. That's individual exceptionalism. That's not systemic equality.
Doc. So that's Black exceptionalism. And I know that Dr. Michelle Alexander, she talks about that in her book, The New Jim Crow. That's Black exceptionalism, as you just stated, Doc. Oh, man, Doc. So let me ask you another question. Reparations. So in the beginning of this interview, I played a 5-minute clip of you testifying at the HR 40 hearing. And correct me if I'm wrong, Doc, the HR 40 hearing was just that. It was a hearing or a proposal to study the effects of slavery, or, to study the effects of slavery. Now,
the original HR 40, as introduced by John Conyers in, I think, 1989, was just a study bill. It was reintroduced as a study and an action bill. So, So it would have created a commission of, I don't know what the number is, of people to basically go around the country, do hearings, study this, and come up with some remedies. Some remedies. So it went a bit further than Congressman Conyers' bill. But let me say this about Congressman Conyers. He was a serious warrior. He introduced that legislation every congressional session from 1989. So that I don't remember what session that was, but from 1989 until 2000 and I want to say 15, 16. Of course, he left Congress, and Sheila Jackson Lee has now picked up the baton. He asked the NARC and other folks to work with Sheila, because she's a fierce one too, to work with Sheila on the reparations issue. And I'll give her lots of credit. She showed up whenever she could to our hearings. We just did a Zoom town hall, and she was right on the town hall with all the rest of us. So she's an active part of the commission. So HR 40 now is a bit stronger than it was before. And there are 205 co-sponsors, but we're certain that most Democrats will vote for it. We're certain that most Republicans will not. And that's so. And even if it were able to pass the House, we know that with its current composition, the Senate would not pass it.
So Doc, a lot of people are asking in the chat room for you to explain why it had to be studied. People are saying, well, we know what the effects of slavery are. We have a lot of data. Why did they need to study it first and then propose remedies? Why can't we just propose remedies, Doc?
I'm with y'all. I mean, frankly, we've studied this. I don't know how long I've written about this over the years. So many others of us have written about it. So people the scholarship is there.
Absolutely.
But again, in the congressional context, this is just how they do it. And it's very interesting because Charles Ogletree, the great Charles Ogletree, I won't say late, but he's been ill. But Charles Ogletree testified before Congress about Tulsa in it was in the 80s. I don't have the exact date, but it was in the 80s. So this issue is not a new issue. It's just that folks don't want to deal with it. See, when you start talking about structural and systemic change, what you're talking about, who's going to give up what?
Mm-hmm.
Let's say that we decide that every Black family is entitled to, let me just pick a number out of a hat. Let's say $250,000. Well, multiply that out. How many $1 trillion is that? What will the tax burden be on that? Who's going to pay those taxes? And that then becomes a different kind of conversation that people are having on the behalf of their constituents. Then when you get these Southern white people who don't believe they ever did anything wrong anyway, enslavement was just how it was supposed to be, that becomes the argument. So, when you have a study, that's how typically things come from Congress. There's a study, there's some hearings, and then there's some legislation to remedy the situation.
Okay. Thank you so much, Doc, for answering that. Now, I've heard a few people throw out some numbers. Marianne Williamson, who was running she was a presidential candidate running on the Democratic Party. She suggested $500 billion. And then I recently read an article maybe a week or two ago, and it said Bob Johnson said we're owed $14 trillion. And I know you are an economist. What do you think? What would be I know that there's no number that could repay us for what we've built, but if you had to throw a number out there, Doc, what would that number be?
I'm not sure. I break it into two parts. Mm-hmm. First of all, there's individual remedy, and then there's community remedy. So if individual remedy, everybody wants a check, and I think that's right. I want one too. But the community remedy is to rebuild some of our institutions, to reclaim some of our historic sites where people have been lynched, to reinvest in our health, where you see the great health disparities that have been basically magnified by the coronavirus. I would suggest that folks go online, if they would, to check out ibw21.org, ibw21.org. They have our whole 10-point plan of what we believe should be reparations. And so it's money plus.
Okay, beautiful.
Rebuild of institutions.
Okay, beautiful. And then that just answered my next question, because I was going to ask you, in what form should we want to receive reparations, cash payments, tax benefits, housing? But you said that information is on your website. So lastly, Doc, with all of this stuff going on, George Floyd and the police, lynchings, that's what I've been calling them, police lynchings. There have been talks about defunding the police and redistributing those funds. What are your thoughts on that? Because I think for me, Doc, I feel like we're getting away from the problem, which is, police brutality. And now they're saying, oh, well, we'll defund the police and we'll redistribute the funds. So I'm kind of feeling like they're trying to pacify us in a sense and not really deal with the issue. But what are your thoughts on that, Doc? The defunding of the police and the redistributing of those funds. Should Black people be happy about that? Well,
see, if I had my way, I just fire them all and start over. I don't think that a civil society can do without an element of, to use the word that is often misused, law and order. You need folks. If somebody's robbing my house, I want to be able to call somebody. I don't want to have to take my baseball bat out. I want to be able to call somebody and say, come get these fools who are trying to rob my house. That's what the police are supposed to do. They're not supposed to stop a young Black boy because he's jaywalking. Some of them have that mentality that we're nothing, that they can just harass us. Put your knee on somebody's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. I say that there's a culture in policing that should be broken up, and bad policemen should just be fired. And we can start over. We can bring younger people. We can bring in people who have more education. I mean, if you go into a small town somewhere, and I'm not dissing people without college degrees, but you might go into a small town and find a 22-year-old, who didn't even go to community college, and he's carrying a gun. A 22-year-old male, and brothers who are listening, forgive me, I've not been disparaging, but people, men and women under 25, their whole brain has not developed yet.
Absolutely.
So you're going to give somebody under 25 a gun, and a young white man too? So I think we need to reimagine what policing looks like. I think we need to reimagine who police officer ought to be and what their role ought to be. I think that anti-racist behavior ought to be a requirement for police officers, and we should call them public safety officers. So that's what really you're talking about, is public safety. But I think that the folks who are talking about defund the police, my most charitable interpretation of what they're saying is to basically move some funds that have been allocated to police departments to other places. Police officers should not be going out trying to be social workers. Folks should not call domestic violence to get cops coming to their house with guns. There ought to be a domestic violence line for folks who could come into your house and fix that without coming in guns. Men have been killed because couples have had fights. So I think that was somebody threw that out there, and it got legs because people are so angry about the way policing has been happening in our country. People are very angry about it. And so given that anger, defund the police sounds great, but I don't think it's practical.
You say you don't think it's practical, Doc? Okay.
I do think that funds could be diverted. So let's say if the police department has let's just call it $100 million budget, which is, I'm just using the 100 as an example. And we find that, 10% of their work is done in schools. I don't want police officers in schools. Take that money and divert it to the schools. If we decide that, 10% of this is going to mental health calls, I don't need police doing mental health work. Send that to the Department of Social Services. So it's not just defund, but right fund.
Right fund.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so, Doc, let me ask you a question. And people have sent me links about this. Have you ever heard of police brutality bonds? There are people there's some folks who are saying, and particularly I'm looking at an article right now. There's a team of researchers called the ACRE team, and they just dropped a study in which they claim that Wall Street banks and investors can make money when racist cops kill Black people. And so they have a report out entitled Black Brutality Bonds, How Wall Street Profits from Police Violence. And it says it exposes, yes, ma'am. And so I was wondering if you knew anything about that.
I do not, but I will, as soon as we get off this program, I will be checking it out.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. And they have a full report. I'll drop the link.
Cool.
I'll drop the link in the chat for my viewers. And also, family, please check out Dr. Julianne's article. She has an article on aclu.org entitled Terrorism and Economic Injustice After Enslavement. So if you want to delve deeper into this information that we've been discussing, you can check out her article. Again, you can find this article on aclu.org. The name of the article is Terrorism and Economic Injustice After Enslavement. Doc, you just recently, earlier today, you sent me another publication did you already drop it yet? The Silver Lining?
It's been filed, but it'll show up in the Black Press probably next week. I write a weekly for nnpa.org. So the Black Press USA. So my deadline's Thursday or Friday, so I send it to them. They'll put it out next week, and it'll be on my website Monday.
Okay, Doc, give them your website, Doc, so they can check it out.
Okay, JulianneMalveaux.com. Real easy, JulianneMalveaux.com. www, of course, but JulianneMalveaux.com.
Yes, family, and check out the article. I read the article today. Thank you so much, Doc, for sharing it with me. But the title of the article is A Silver Lining to a Slap in the Face by Dr. Julianne. Doc, you brought it in this article, and I appreciate you and I appreciate your work. Doc, is there any other projects that you have going on? Anything that we can anticipate coming up from you, Doc?
Well, you know, I'm working on a book. It's taken me forever, but I'm working on a book on Black money, really dealing with these themes of economic envy from history to now. And I had, until this Corona stuff happened, a show at UDC TV, but we'll be reprising that very soon. Every other Monday, you can hear me on WPFW, Monday mornings at 9, but every other Monday. Andy Shalal and I take turns. And that's about it.
All right, beautiful, beautiful. And Doc, and when you were just talking about a book, I was thinking about, I have a book over there called The Color of Wealth and The Color of Law. Are you familiar with those two books, Doc?
It's sitting right under my desk. Actually.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So thank you so much, Doc, for coming on. Family, if you have any questions for Doc while we have her for another 7 or 8 minutes. If you have any questions for Doc, please post questions in the chat at this time. I'm looking at the YouTube chat, and I'm also monitoring my Facebook chat. If you have any question for Dr. Julianne while we have her, please feel free to post your questions at this time.
Now, sis, how are you monitoring the Facebook and the this and the that? How many hands you have?
Oh, look, you said, Doc, I'm I have two. I have two, Doc. So yes, ma'am. On my screen to the right, I can see I'm using a platform called StreamYard, and so it allows you to look at comments on Facebook and YouTube, since I'm streaming on both platforms. Okay. Yes, ma'am. So I'm looking, and yep, I'm looking. I don't think we see. I don't see any questions yet, Doc. Come on, family. We have the great doctor with us right now. If you have any questions.
I see a comment here from JT Coin Rings. JT
yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Words makes the machine go brr to a tune of 27 trillion. They can pay reparations. They could. We could do any number of things if there were the political will. What I would say is that taking a 27 trillion or we would have to decide what the number was, decide how it got paid, and decide how it's going to be, if it came out of the Treasury, how it will be repaid. It's not impossible. If there was a political will, we could fix this within a decade. We really could. But we have a president who said, what did he say yesterday? I wrote it down. It was so ignorant. I have a whole notebook if I wrote down something every time he says something ignorant. But what did he say? He said something, we can fix racism quickly and easily. Yeah, we can fix it. It's like, okay, well, why didn't we do it 400 years ago? Or even let's say 2, you know? That man really makes my temperature rise.
Oh yeah, same with me, Doc, and the same with the people in my family. When he gets one,
you know,
absolutely, absolutely.
Systemic racism, and half his cabinet does not believe there's any such thing as systemic racism. I don't know.
So, Doc, let me ask you a question, Doc. Let's say that we don't get reparations, right? What can Black people do to generate wealth? I know Dr. Claude Anderson, he wrote a beautiful book, Powernomics. Dr. Amos Wilson wrote what I call my Bible Blueprint for Black Power, and they talked about ways of accumulating wealth. So let's say that we don't get reparations. I know some Black folks are waiting for it. Some of us don't think we're going to ever get it.
Look, we shouldn't be waiting for it. It is that we have been ripped off since we came on these shores. Since we came here 401 years ago, that we have been systematically ripped off. We didn't get the 40 acres of the mule. We might not have this issue if those folks who had been enslaved left enslavement with something to build up. But instead, the little bit that we were able to build, they snatched back, they clapped back. So when we look at, so nobody should be waiting for reparations. That's like waiting for Godot. You know, and you know the play, Waiting for Godot, where you wait and you wait and you wait and Godot never comes. So I'm not saying that reparations will never come. But what I'm saying is that we should not consider ourselves waiting. What we should be doing is accumulating.
That's right.
But I heard somebody mention Dr. Sandy Darity, who was one of my classmates at MIT. And he talks about, in one of his pieces, he says, if Black people saved every penny they earned, we couldn't close the wealth gap. And that's the truth. The gap is so large. But what we can do is make our own families economically stable. What we can do from an entrepreneurial perspective is to basically combine our monies and do things together. And one of the things that, one of the ways that people get wealthy is to find a unique product, a unique good or service that nobody else has, that they have a monopoly on. They have a monopoly on and people want. Then they can basically jump into the competitive market and try to accumulate wealth that way. That's a long shot, but it's possible. If you want to look, a good example is Bob Johnson. BET started out as a cable station, like a DC cable station in DC. Marion Barry gave him the franchise. He took that thing and ran with it. Look at it now. He got in before cable was a big thing, and he was able to build that and grow that. And now you have a multi-billionaire. And the people who are on the ground floor of his company, many of them are millionaires today. So it's finding that, there are folks who have those kind of brains to find that unique thing that people want, and they get it out there.
So a business. So you say, we need to economically stabilize our families. You said open a business. I was thinking about stocks. I know my family, we've been delving into the stock market. Life insurance, life insurance policies. I have a cousin who told me that, look, she said, I got $1 million life insurance policy. So if something happens to me, my 2 children, they get $1 million. So I'm thinking life insurance policies, businesses, stocks, investment, real estate investments, and things of that nature. So you're saying that we should start building wealth and accumulating wealth within our families, within our
communities. But there are 2 struggles here. One, the basic struggle, I call the micro struggle, is to keep yourself financially stable. With the high unemployment rates and everything else, many Black families are struggling.
Absolutely.
I always tell people, don't have a plan A and B, have a plan A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Multiple income streams, multiple ways, essentially to essentially bring money in. So that's the micro struggle. The macro struggle is how to close the wealth gap, how to get economic justice for Black people. And I would suggest that we can do both. You're not going to sit by the side of the road waiting for reparations, because if you do that, you'll just be sitting by the side of the road. We can struggle for reparations. We can do the work around reparations. We also have to do the work around our own, what happens in our own houses in our own communities.
Absolutely. And so Sister Camille Jones in the chat, she asked, how can we fund businesses when the banks won't loan us the capital to grow?
That's a great question, especially after this ripoff situation where $500 billion has gone out of our treasury to loan to so-called small businesses, and they can't tell us who got the money. They can't tell us what percentage of Black folks got it. They can't tell us anything. They said they don't know. No, they didn't say they don't know. That's not the truth. They said they won't say. After Congresswoman Waters put it in the legislation that they had to release data, macro data on what percent. Now, what's his name? Mnuchin says, I ain't going to say. Sisters, some banks will, one of the challenges for you is to find a smaller, not a B of A or Wells Fargo, but a smaller bank that you can develop a relationship with. That's how you're going to be able to get some money for your business. Make sure that you keep impeccable records, etc. Have a business plan, but mostly the big banks aren't going to pay very much attention to you. The smaller banks will.
I know that in Blueprint for Black Power and Powernomics, Dr. Claude Anderson and Dr. Amos Wilson also suggested, Doc, in creating a susu, where people put money in a pot and then the pot is passed around. They both stated that that's how a lot of the Asians finance their businesses. Basically, it was the family who started susus. They said yes, ma'am. And Caribbean people
put in whatever they put in. They put it into 10 people. You put in. Everybody puts in what a month? $500 a month. At the end of, you're going to end up with a pot of like $5,000. And that pot is going to go around every month. Somebody's going to get the pot. It's a doable thing. It's definitely doable. And the other thing is to look at the small business resources in your community. Looking at minority business development agencies. They're not trying to do a lot for us, but they do some. This is one of the places I think, and where 45 may be useful. He doesn't want to talk about racism. He doesn't want to talk about.
It's 9 o'clock.
He doesn't want to talk about racism. He doesn't want to talk about police brutality, but he will talk about economic development. He will talk about that. Yesterday he made some comment about he wants to give more money to HBCUs. So it's interesting. I mean, there's some things we can play him on. He always talks about entrepreneurship, but since to try to develop some relationships, both with the Small Business Administration, they have regional offices, but also with a small to medium-sized bank where you can develop a relationship where they can get to know your business and where they can actually feel more free to lend to you than a big bank. That's why Black banks are so important. But once upon a time, we had over 100 of them. Now we have 23.
You're right, Doc. I read that in Blueprint for Black Power. And I was like, wow, we went from 100 to 20. I read 28. You said now we're down to 23. Yeah. Goodness gracious.
22. But anyway, no, because a number of things happen. Some of them changing in banking regulations, some of them economic envy. But frankly, some of them our own challenges. Black-owned banks have unique challenges. If we're seen as a Black-owned bank, community bank, then people in the community say, we fought for you to be here, now lend me some money.
Right.
Well, if you don't have the fundamentals, it would be fiscally irresponsible for me to lend you money. Just saying. We had a really horrible case in Boston about maybe 3 years ago where bank was called One United Bank, and they lent a Black church a bunch of money to do this expansion. They lent it right before we went into the recession. So the church couldn't pay the bank back. So federal FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, sanctioned the bank, told them to go get your money. So imagine this, you have a Black bank and a Black church suing each other in court. So we often put a lot of pressure on our institutions in terms of what they're supposed to do. We can do a lot of things, but we have to be fiscally responsible. We just can't give people money.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Doc. And the last question, because I know it is 9 o'clock. How do we, the same sister, she said also, how can we get legislation to make us a protected group? And I know that Dr. Claude Anderson talks about that in his book Powernomics, that we need to get legislation passed that will protect us, just like the Native Americans had legislation passed to make them a protected group. How do we go about doing that, Doc?
Find a member of Congress who's interested in this. Find a member of Congress. So that's how the legislation gets introduced. Do you want to do it federally, or do you want to do it from a statewide level? Sometimes it's easier to do something at a statewide level and it trickles up, but sometimes to do it at the federal level, especially, we have a 53-member Congressional Black Caucus now, that once it's in federal, it could trickle down. So it's finding an interested legislator who will push this agenda.
Okay. All right, Doc. All right. Well, thank you so much, Doc. I'm sorry, did I cut you off, Doc? Or
No, I was just saying thank you. It's been fun.
No, thank you so much, Doc, for coming on. I appreciate your time. Doc, when I end the broadcast, don't go anywhere. I still want to ask you something. But family, thanks for tuning in. Please go back into the archives and listen to the other shows. Just yesterday, I had Anthony T. Browder on the platform, and we talked about ancient Kemet Christianity and his ASA restoration project. A few days ago, I had Dr. Taka Kilimanjaro on. I've had Professor James Smalls, Dr. Kaba Kamene. I'm trying to think who else. It was so many interviews and so many more to come. So family, go into the archives, check it out. If you aren't subscribed to my channel, go to YouTube, type in my name, Dr. Oya Ma'at, subscribe, hit the notification bell so that as soon as I go live or I post a video, you will be notified. Thank you so much, family, for tuning in. Peace and Black Power.